Hello, my name is Randy Thomas, and I decided to do my project on a historic labor law, and the law I decided to discuss is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So what will be covered in this presentation? What is the Fair Labor Standards Act? What was the issue that caused the Fair Labor Standards Act to be made? The work environment before the FLSA was passed. Why is this law so important for America? How has this law changed people's lives for the better? And how does a college graduate benefit our country? So, what is the Fair Labor Standards Act? The Fair Labor Standards Act establishes minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and youth employment standards affecting employees in the private sector and in federal, state, and local governments. Covered non-exempt workers are entitled to a minimum wage of not less than $7.25 per hour effective July 24, 2009. Overtime pay at a rate not less than 1.5 times the regular rate of pay is required after 40 hours of work in a work week. So what was the issue that caused the Fair Labor Standards Act to be made? Prior to the Fair Labor Standards Act being enacted, both adults and young children worked brutally long hours only to earn starvation wages. This was especially true during the Great Depression. As the Depression endured, firms not only laid off hundreds of thousands of workers, but also implemented significant wage rate cuts. Despite the low wages, or perhaps many workers, including children, continued to work long hours and unjust conditions to provide housing, food, and clothes for their families the best way they could. Workers often labored in what were essentially sweatshops, only to earn low wages. So, what was the work environment before the FLSA was passed? Child labor was seen as a fairly cheap source of labor, and many adults competed with children in New York for work. This was especially evident from 1928 until 1935, as the Great Depression hit because of the crashing stock markets, which resulted in many families to grow poor and children had to find somewhere to work while their elders waited for relief in breadlines. Financially, children supported their families while their caregivers waited for food to feed their families. Though many people believed child labor did not occur in the factories following the 1925 child labor amendments, children worked in farms as laborers because the laws did not apply to the fields. In the census of 1930, 2 million children aged 10 through 18 still worked, and 700,000 of them were under the age of 15. Most worked in the agricultural sector during summer vacation. Federal surveys said children worked 12-hour shifts on tobacco, beet, and cotton plantations. One specific type of child-intensive labor was when children worked with on their parents' farm. Parents could use their children's work for their own benefit, and there was no legal way of limiting the hours children worked nor regulation for their safety. So why is the FLSA so important? The Fair Labor Standards Act was a great success. A special study conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that the act would raise wages for almost 700,000 workers, reduce hours or prompt overtime pay for over 1.5 million workers, and prohibit the continued employment of roughly 600,000 children aged 10 to 15, and it also put adult Americans back to work and guaranteed that they would be treated and compensated more fairly. The Fair Labor Standards Act succeeded in improving labor standards and actual working conditions, a result that continues to better the. So another reason why the FLSA is so important. The FLSA child labor provisions were nearly identical to those in the Keating-Owen bill, restricting industries for children under age of 18, limiting working hours for children under 16, and banning children under 14 from most kinds of work. The law also requires employers to document the age of child workers and empowers the Secretary of Labor to investigate possible violations. Similar to the Keating-Owen and the child labor tax law, the FLSA was challenged and ultimately argued before the Supreme Court. However, reversing earlier precedent, the court upheld the FLSA and it remains in force today. So how has this law changed people's lives for the better? As enrollment and graduation rates have risen, so has overall educational attainment in the United States. Prior to the FLSA being passed, fewer than 1 in 5 people over the age of 25 possessed a high school diploma. By 2011, nearly 88% of people in this age group held diplomas. As more people completed high school, the pool of potential college applicants increased. This, in part, has contributed to the steady rise in bachelor's degree holders. This graph demonstrates the decade-by-decade increase in the percentage of adults who have graduated high school and then moved on to graduate college. And as we look at this graph, we can see in the 1930s, it was only 20% of high school completion or higher. And in 1940 is around 25%. And when you're in the moment, high school seems like a big accomplishment, but in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, that was a huge accomplishment to graduate high school. But today, I feel like high school is just like an average, like just go to school and you graduate. And so I've always known I was gonna go to college, but high school wasn't a big deal for me. Like graduating to Stan State will be. So it's very fortunate. So that this law passed so children doesn't have to think about working or providing for their parents and they can go focus on school and go to college so they can have a better job and better life for their families so they don't have to be in those living and working conditions. So how does a college graduate benefit our country? An average bachelor's degree recipient contributes $381,000 more in taxes than they use in government services and programs over their lifetime. Those with high school degrees just contribute $26,000 more. That's a contribution of $355,000 more per bachelor's degree holder over those whose highest degree is a high school diploma. Bachelor's degree holders are more civically engaged than their high school educated peers. For example, 52% of people with a high school degree vote, and 75% of people who obtain a bachelor's degree votes. Bachelor's degree holders are 2 times more likely to volunteer, and for charitable contributions by bachelor's degree holders are 3.5 times higher. So the conclusion. I really enjoyed doing this project because I didn't really know about the labor laws or regulations. So when I really looked into this, I was very surprised that the FLSA, you know, manages the overtime or manages the child labor because that's a really big issue. Children are our future of America. So if a child works and they don't focus on themselves or their schooling, then their future is going to be just work and they don't they don't unlock their full potential. Imagine if all the children work and they never went to school. Imagine how our society would be today. So I'm very fortunate enough to go to school and have a better life for myself and my family instead of working in the farm or working in the factory, which is nothing wrong with that. But I'm just for myself very fortunate because I used to do that when I was a kid, all the way through my junior college. I used to be in a produce stand, chopping wood and selling produce, or going out in the field and picking vegetables. I mean, I liked doing it. It wasn't no problem because I was helping, but so I couldn't imagine my life like that forever. So that's why I'm very fortunate enough to go to Stanislaus State and continue my education, have a better life for myself and my family. And the facts that were I showed in the bar graph before about the high school completion and going on to college is very astounding also, because as we saw in the 1930s and 40s, it was very low. And see now in our generation, high school completion is higher. So it's very good for our people in society because we can have a basic knowledge of life and whatever in our experience in high school, and we can have fairly decent jobs when we go to college. So it's very interesting. I was very astounded when I saw that bar graph. And I was very surprised also about how much people with a bachelor's degree contributes more than people with a high school diploma, because that's something I have to do when I obtain my bachelor's degree and start working. So I had a fun time doing this presentation, and I'm looking forward to learning more and expanding my knowledge and furthering my career. Thank you so much.